Okay. Well. Okay. Uh-oh. This moved.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome. We're going to have a panel discussion called Wars, Terrorism, It is Bloody Good Business. So we have three distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce them to you. One of them is Mark Sandlin. He's an ordained PCUSA minister serving at Presbyterian Church of the Covenant in Greensboro. Mr. Sandlin is a co-founder of the Christian Left and blogs at the God article. He has been featured on NPR's The Story with Dick Gordon, PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly, and the upcoming documentary film Amendment 1. Our second speaker is Roberto Campo, and he's a professor of French, director of International and Global Studies, and director of French Graduate Study at UNCG. His specialties are 16th century French literature, poetic and aesthetic theory of antiquity and the Renaissance, laughter theory, and Orientalism. Dr. Campo is a recipient of UNCG's University Alumni Teaching Excellence Award. And our third speaker is Edip Yuksel. He came from Tucson, Arizona. He's a Jewish doctor, American, Turkish, Kurdish author, and progressive activist. He spent 5 years in prison for promoting Islamic revolution in Turkey. In 1986, for criticizing the Orthodox teaching and practices, multiple fatwa declared him heretic. He knows Turkish, English, Arabic, and Persian. Edip's English books include Quran, a reformist translation, Manifesto for Islamic Reform, Peacemaker's Guide to Warmongers, and 19 God's Signature in Nature and Scripture. Edip studied philosophy and law at the University of Arizona. Besides writing and lecturing, Edip works as an adjunct philosophy professor at Pima College. He is the founder of Islamic Reform 114 and co-founder of MPJP, which stands for Muslims for Peace, Justice, and Progress Organizations. And Edip was supposed to give a lecture yesterday called Hallelujah, Allahu Akbar, killing each other in the name of God.
Can you show us here?
Yeah, I'll show this.
People to see.
Unfortunately, we had to cancel this because of weather yesterday. But I asked our distinguished guests to allow Edip additional 15 to 20 minutes to kind of make up this speech. It's impossible, I know, but they have agreed, Edip talking about this topic for about 15 to 20 minutes before we start our panel discussion. And then I'm gonna give them a startup question about the panel, okay? And please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Who are you? What about you? Did you introduce yourself?
My name is Ali Askarov. I'm a faculty at Peace and Conflict Studies Department here at UNCG. Thank you.
Anyone who is familiar with this, just moving without trouble. Anyone would like to take over? Just once in a while you may focus or not. Can you do it? Okay, please do so. Go ahead. And if it finishes, I think it's about how many minutes? 80 minutes total I have. I have another card here. You can stop it. Because it is important. Right now we are in different age. More people, tens of thousands will watch here than this room alone. Correct? And we need to be nice to these people who are watching. Now, okay. In fact, I brought this one. I wanted to wear this, and it is hot. I will not wear this beautiful handmade by my sister. While I was in Turkish prison, I instructed her to make something with rainbow on it, because in prison we didn't have much light. And when I see now ISIS psychopaths are wearing all black, I thought it would be a great contrast that we like colors, we like diversity. I thank you very much for allowing me to have 15-20 minutes introduction. It is important, I think, to a little bit introduce myself, because myself and cause, it became together. It is my own personal change or paradigm change, and then what followed afterwards. And now it is a movement in the world. We call it, some people call it Quranism or Islamic reform. But it started in 1974. In 1974, a guy here in the United States, in Tucson, Arizona, called Rashad Khalifa, which is considered like a demon, a devil, or a murtad. They call it apostate, heretic, all the words, negative words in their dictionary. Because that guy started a study, research. He was a biochemist from Egypt. He found errors in in English translations of the Quran. He decided to make his own translation, because they're all made by scholars, religious scholars, clergymen, who have problem with reasoning. They all memorize and they repeat whatever they memorize, dogmatic. And this is a scientist guy, he knows scientific methodology. Therefore, he decides to make his own translation. And he says, I will not pass a verse unless I understand it. Well, it takes 7 verses. The first chapter of the Quran is a short one, the opening chapter. It starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the gracious, the compassionate. And 7 verses translated, and then gets stuck with a very short verse, 3 letters or 3 numbers. And no one knew the meaning of it until 1974. It is a secret of the Quran, it's well known. They came up with many speculations, ideas at the end, ending up, really God knows the meaning of it. 29 chapters start with this kind of letter or number combinations, because that time during revelation of the Quran, Arabs were not using the Arabic numerals we call today. 200 years later, after Muhammad, they got it from India, they passed to Europe. But before that, they were using their alphabet, like Hebrew, as numbers. And therefore, these are really numbers and also letters. And then he put the Quran into the computer. That time he was working for a big company in, I think it was in Texas, Louisville or somewhere, I forgot. Anyway, mainframe computers that time, you know, those that punch holes. While he's waiting for the yeast to grow, cultivate, and he put the Quran into the computer by transliterating Arabic letters into these Latin alphabets. And he ended up with the initial statistics, first time in history, a little idea about what could be the relation of these letters to the Quran. He found that statistically, the frequency of the letters started in these chapters, the frequency of these letters highest in those chapters that they initially. Well, it is a no-brainer. You wonder why 1400 years, it took 1406 years, why no one thought about that to count the letters and find statistical relationship. Well, it was not meant. And then he publishes this one in 1973, and then in 1974, he comes up, he finds that these numbers seem some odd, some even, some big, some small. They are all multiple of 19. And it opens up entirely a new discovery and a paradigm change. You may not think there is connection between mathematics and my being a heretic, and many people, thousands of people like me, you have no idea what's going on. It is a very interesting, clear relationship. And I want to give you a few examples because that's very important. The same, in fact, code was discovered in Old Testament, some original parts of the Old Testament in 11th century by Rabbi Judah. Later we learned, in 1984, a periodical, a journal published by University of California, Professor Joseph Dunn translated some of the work of Rabbi Judah, a Hasidim. And this guy has written 8 volumes according to his writings, but only 1 volume we have. He translates some part of it is exactly like the code in the Quran. It's not Bible code, which, how many of you heard of Bible code? It was once, it was best-selling and a lot of brouhaha and stuff, but it ended up becoming nonsense because it didn't really have statistical significance. I studied it, it was nonsense. But also numerology, a lot of numerology around that, speculation, esoteric, arbitrary from here and there, and no connection, anecdotal observation. This is not, this is a system. That when you understand the system, you predict, you say the next word, frequency of this word will be this way. Or this letter is written today's manuscript wrong, and everyone challenges you. How in the world you say there is manuscript, today's manuscript is wrong? Just on top of your head you make it up. No, you say according to this mathematical code, this letter should be not this way, the other way. For example, chapter 7, verse 69, the word bastatan in today's old version written with sad, over it a little sin, another letter, you say this is mistake, error, it must be written with sin. Because the count of sad in the chapter starting with sad, 3 chapters, chapter 7, chapter 19, and chapter 38, they are 152. With this one, it will be 153, one more. 152 is multiple of 19, but the other is not. And then later you go, you check the oldest manuscripts available, let's say the Tashkent copy, you check that word, you find exactly it is written like it was predicted by the numerical code. Codes have error correction functions. And then you see that today it is erroneous, but the code predicts. Scientific theories are verifiable and also falsifiable, must be falsifiable. Verification is not enough. You should have logically another way to falsify it, otherwise it is just a claim. And also predictable. Anyway, this guy finally publishes his work on this mathematical numerical code, which is, it is prophesied in a chapter, which is the name of the chapter is the hidden one, chapter 74. The name of the chapter, hidden one, the secret. And no one knew the implication of 19 in that chapter. It is mentioned only in that chapter. And then they have so many question problems with that verse. Someone claims that this Quran is made up by Muhammad, is human-made, it influences people. The author of the Quran, whoever says, I will punish that person, what kind of punishment? It is obvious for everyone, it's not more, it's not less, it is obvious for humanity, and it is 19. What is the connection? And then the following verse talks about the functions of 19, it's exactly happening after that, exactly happening. And chapter 19 is mentioned in this chapter, and we see that it is discovered in 1974. 19 is mentioned in chapter 74 as a proof, as evidence that the Quran is God's word, and it is discovered in 1974, 19 times 74 lunar years after the revelation of the Quran. 19 times 74 lunar years after revelation of the Quran. In 1974, 19, the meaning of 19 in chapter 74 was discovered. There are many very interesting prophetic nature of this. Therefore, after this, what happened? There were several traditionally not questioned dogmas was rejected by this. And then you started questioning Sunni and Shiite dogmas and religions. Because major claims that they unify, you find out it is false. Like Trinity in Christianity, we argue that it was made up centuries after Jesus. It doesn't even exist in the Old Testament, New Testament. It is coined in Nicene Conference in 325. We can talk about that. We have a priest here. Fantastic. Anyway, I know this issue for you new, and I think that you understand, perhaps you understand about 15-20% what I am saying, correct? I lost you, but that's good. I want you, few of you maybe get curious, because I gave lectures on this to professors in mathematics at the University of Arizona, about 30 doctorate students and professors. 1 hour I spent and you challenged them, their honor, their mathematics knowledge. And then they came up with few weak questions and stuff. They got not much. Why? Because of paradigm issue. Thomas Kuhn. How many of you heard of Thomas Kuhn? Thomas Kuhn, K-H-U-N. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In that book talks about this. That scientific community also all human beings. They are also in the box of their convention. Like Ptolemaic model, the Earth Center model, when start becoming problematic after the discovery of bigger telescopes, better observation, they found that the location of that particular planet is not exactly what is predicted by the model. Therefore, they had to create epicenters, retrograde motion, made it complicated. It was not that precise, predictive. And then Copernicus comes, says, kick the Earth, put the sun in the middle, and then perfect, fantastic, precise, and simple. You don't have all those complications. You don't need to be genius to say this makes more sense. Not the Earth Center. You have so much complication, it doesn't even predict as much as this one. But contemporary scientists who were genius, they did not accept it. Why? Because there is a convention long at 1,000 years. To challenge that one requires what? Heart, independence, and some courage, because there is church out there that says, I will beat you if you say that the earth is not the center of the universe. And the same this one. My son is at Princeton University. I had a conference there. I participated in a conference as a speaker. And meanwhile, I'm there. I said, let's see these scientists, the mathematicians here. They are geniuses because Einstein was there. And then I met, I don't want to go there, but 2 mathematicians for half an hour. They asked their challenges. I answered. You expect them what? If I was one of them, if I were, I wouldn't leave and say I have a class. I would say this is interesting. This book is 2 billion people believes and historically changed the history, whether true or not. But now you claim there is mathematics in this book and I am a mathematician. Just give you 2 examples, not 19. 19 is a system. It requires maybe 1 hour of presentation. But just 2 examples before 19 we knew. The word month, shahr in Arabic, mentioned in the Quran 12 times. Coincidence? Of course could be coincidence. The word day, this month in singular form, exactly 12 times. And the word day, yawm, it is in Arabic yawm, in singular form yawm is mentioned how many times? Anyone, any number?
19.
1, yes, what else?
360.
What? 360. Your name is Jeremy. Let me get Jeremy. He knows it. Okay, Jeremy is a professor here. He got it 365. The others, college students, could not know these numbers. Jeremy, look at this, please, whether I am in the middle or somewhere. Okay, now, yes, 365. Now, go from the library, I challenge you, get any book, or go on e-books, check the frequency of the word month and day. These are relevancy to their astronomical, it is an astronomical fact. It's not just an arbitrary number. He didn't count the word day in the Quran, but it's exactly 365. Now, does it mean that the Quran is word of God? Not at all. But at least it tells you the author of the Quran, whoever is, counted the words in this book. Most likely, that this book is interesting. But when you say the Quran, those people in Princeton, they think This woman whose identity is taken away by veil, the oppression, or slavery, or stoning to death, or chopping heads, backward people. Absolutely, this is one of the things that most frustrating. This book has nothing to do with this action. It's absolutely all of those things are against this book. Do you think medieval ages, if we live that time, witch hunting, burning the translator of the Bible, the Canal, on stake? I have a book about torture machines invented by priests like this gentleman. In medieval age, I have a book. If there was patent service that time, they would get hundreds of patents on torture machine. God, these guys, do they have anything to do with Jesus? With the message of Jesus, with the Bible? Not at all. Because I know the Bible, I studied it, it's one of my favorite books. Jesus, the guy who say, love your neighbor and love your enemy. How can you imagine this guy became the murderers of this? Therefore, looking at ISIS or Taliban or today's Muslim, judging this book is one of the atrocious. It doesn't make sense. But unfortunately, we are human beings. It is foreign, and we see this one, we want to stay away. Okay. How many minutes I have? 2 minutes, yeah, I want to come back. Now, this is an incredible topic anyway. Here it is. I changed. I was a leader of Islamist group there. The Turkish president, he was my friend. Tayyip Erdogan. From school friend, from the movement, he was my friend. He was in the party. He was the leader of the youth in party. There was also parallel youth organization. I was leader of that. And in fact, he was rank-wise behind me. The prime minister, he was my friend from the university, Ahmet Davutoğlu. We were together. I was considered as a hero. My father was the biggest scholar in Turkey, a religious scholar, who later disowned me because of this. I was invited to Iran 1 year after revolution in 1980. How to import or export, from their perspective, export, from our perspective, import the Iranian revolution. I was in contact with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hizb ut-Tahrir of Iraq, with Hizb Islami, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, met him, give him money collected from when they were fighting the Russians. But afterwards, in 1st July 1986, when I communicated with this guy, Rashad Khalifa, who was killed in 1990 by a terrorist group affiliated to Al-Qaida, it's considered Al-Qaida's first violent act in the United States. When I started discussing, I found out my religion, that I put my life. 4 years I was in prison because of the trying to bring such a revolution. I found that it's absolutely distorted. It has nothing to do with the Quran. Mathematics led me to think rationally. That believe that someone tells me stories about God, why should I believe those stories? If there is God, the creator of the universe, He rewards us when we question. Any scientist here, the more question you ask, the more knowledge, the more technology, power, benefits. If the same God is the sender of this message in church, in mosque, in where, when you ask questions, He should not be punishing you. You should, yes, ask more questions to your priest, to your imam, to your rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edip. One more time, we're going to discuss the question, the topic, which is called Wars, Terrorism, It is Bloody Good Business. And one more time, our speakers are Edip Yuksel and Roberto Campo and Mark Sandlin and Ali Askarov. So I'll have a question for startup discussion. Okay, I initially wanted to give them 2 rounds of speaking, but maybe 1 round would be enough because of time. Then I'm going to get your questions for discussion. Okay, so Islam is not a new religion, right? It emerged in the 7th century, but since then people ask questions: is it a religion of war or peace? Right? Still, like, I encounter that question every single day almost. Okay. But war is not a new phenomenon as well, right? War is pretty old. Like thousands of years ago we had war in different forms, but still we had. And terrorism is not a new phenomenon. It's also pretty old. But the fact is that in our times, in late modern times, terrorism has acquired a very complicated character, right? Why? Is this a coincidence? This is the question for you. Or it is a real politic, okay?
Don't start from me.
Okay.
Would you like to go first, maybe?
That's okay. Go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
All right. I'm going to try to be short. Okay. As professors tend to do, they can go real long. So anyway, throw something at me in about 10 minutes if you would, just to remind me that I'm going off way too long. As Ali mentioned at the beginning here, my area of expertise doesn't seem to fit well, perhaps, with the topic in question, although there are interesting connections that I want to make here. Professor of French, right, Director of International Global Studies, many of you know that. My students are here this afternoon. My area, one of the areas that I've been working in for quite some time is called Orientalism, but not in the broadest sense of that, so that we would be looking truly at the Eastern Orient, China, Japan, and so forth, Southeast Asia and all that, which is another area of exploration. But I tend to be looking at the connections between the French Francophone world, particularly the French world, and the Middle East and the Levant and the Maghreb area, as well to a certain extent into Africa. This is an area that's become interesting to me, particularly because, as Ali likewise mentioned, I'm a specialist of something called the Renaissance, which is the 16th century from the French perspective. For us, and it's during that time that we have some very interesting connections going on around the world with these parts of the world, in fact, with the Levant, with West Asia, of course with Turkey in particular, and to a certain extent later into Persia. These are areas with which France had a lot of activity, a lot of connections. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint here. It's sort of just more to guide my comments than anything else and help you kind of follow along with some of the things I want to talk about here. But that's sort of where I'm coming from that understanding of things. And then I want to try to contextualize a little bit, in particular, terrorism as it relates to what we all know well about, too well about perhaps, as of November 13th, 2015, right? You all heard about the attacks in Paris. 130 people were killed, multiple nationalities, among them, as we know. Probably 300, 400 other people were injured in those attacks. And so forth. 9 terrorists in particular were implicated in this, at least directly in that attack. And of course you can also look at the Charlie Hebdo incident a little bit earlier in 2015 in January. A lot going on, in other words, in France. So I want to kind of take a look at that recent event and try to give it some context. I think it's really important for us to be able to understand events in context. Just as I do when I'm looking at things going on in the 16th century. So I wanted to pull out a little bit of history, some perspective indeed on some current policies, politics, and so forth that's going on there. And I'd like to conclude with a little review of a very interesting, it seems to me, theory that was presented by a very important scholar professor who now resides in Italy, in fact, in Florence, named Olivier Roy. Or some people might say Olivier Roy, R-O-Y. It's a name, I think you'll see his name here in a moment. He's just had an article out, sort of at the, actually he wrote it about the 24th or so of November, so a few days after the attack. It was subsequently translated and republished in English in Foreign Policy. That's something you might all want to go back and take a look at. He's a tremendous scholar and somebody that is worth listening to, I think, on this particular topic. So he kind of explodes some things that we might be thinking about what terrorism means in the French Francophone context here. So with that, I'm going to hope that the technology works. You never know about these things. Let's see what happens here. So anyway, I wanted to start you off with a shocking image, which we're not going to stick around and look at a bunch of shocking images, I promise you that. Of course, this is one of the attack sites. This was in front of one of the cafes. I think there were like 5 or 6 different cafe restaurants that were attacked on that fateful evening. As we know, you know about the Bataclan Theater attack. And by the way, you probably heard that the group, the rock group, has returned today, coincidentally enough, to Paris to perform this evening. which would be now over, of course, but they were doing that again this evening, so it's an interesting coincidence there. Again, as you know, about 130 people died in the incident, not counting the terrorists themselves, and lots of others were injured. So let's go look a little bit at the history. I mentioned that that's an area that I like to look at. It's very important for me to understand what I'm doing in terms of looking at literary representations of these relationships. So, y'all heard the Crusades, right? Somewhere along the way? Yeah, well, the French played a big role in that, okay? You've probably seen representations of that in film, and you've read stuff about it and so forth. That goes back, of course, the first crusade goes back to the 11th century, the end of the 11th century, right? We're talking 1095 there. And we have the first call to launch a crusade. In fact, and that was probably France's most involved first interaction with the Islamic world. In fact, it actually goes back a bit further. Actually, into the 9th century, we had Leo IV call for a similar participation against the Franks, or participating as Franks, not French in that day, against the Islamic Muslim invaders actually into Italy at that time. So, in fact, all of this interaction with that world goes back a little bit further. But the principal part goes with the Crusades. Now, there were 7 different Crusades, right? These things kept going on, and every opportunity, right, go off and prove yourself in battle and, you know, proselytize, bring supposedly Christianity to the Islamic heathen world, right? And of course, I'm not even going to go into the politics and so forth that go along with that. But that was certainly an important context. It's represented in literature in many important works in the French tradition. You may have heard of the Conquête de Constantinople of Villehardouin, Conquest of Constantinople by Villehardouin is the author's name. You've heard of it, maybe, the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, okay? An anonymous author, we're not quite sure who that would have been, but that's a very famous epic. Likewise, it represents some of the activities and politics and ideologies in play then. Moving on a little bit, the Ottoman Empire, of course, gets going, in particular during the 15th century and the 16th century. It's at its climax in many ways with Suleiman the Magnificent. You may have heard of him at some point or another, if only because he's magnificent, right? And memorable in that respect. But there are a lot of interesting things going on in France and the connections with that world at that point, not the least of which were alliances between the French crown, in particular Francis I, and Henry II, okay? These were the Valois kings, mid-16th or beginning of and mid-16th century, who allied themselves with the Turks in order to balance off, if you will, the geopolitical designs of the Holy Roman Empire in Spain. There was this big Spanish-French thing going on in the world, and they created these interesting alliances. They weren't always happy alliances. Very often they crumbled and had to be rebuilt. But it was indeed a significant political and especially military connection that was going on during this time. I mentioned here also commerce. Commerce began to develop significantly. Likewise, at this point, the French found wonderful access to all the good stuff from the Middle Eastern world, and of course all the way from China, because some of the products through the Silk Road to some extent were still active there, and access to other goods, spices, textiles, products of all sorts. Jumping big time, a couple of centuries here, we go to the Napoleonic period here. Of course, we're talking about Napoleon's incursion into Egypt, beginning of the 19th century, of course, and there's interesting connections through the generals and so forth that participate in that project that put France, likewise again, very much with a footprint into the northern African Maghreb area, Middle East, and Egypt specifically. I'll fill in a little bit more here when we actually have a little bit later on something of the Suez Canal project that comes up actually during for those of you who are in my IGS 200 class, we've spoken about this. Suez Canal project begins about the middle of the 19th century, likewise in that same region, with all kinds of geopolitical interesting designs going on as part of that. Napoleon in Egypt, or rather Algeria comes up at 1830. That's the first incursion of France into Algeria in 1830. As you probably know, they will remain there. So it's kind of like other countries in this world, which when they arrive in the Middle East or in a Muslim country, don't leave. Okay, that tends to be the case. That was the case indeed during this period. They were there for another 130 years roughly in Algeria. That's the French. all kinds of things, and have expanded out, of course, into Morocco, Tunisia, and made their way, of course, into Western Africa, as we well know, over the next few decades. So that period of colonialism, and French colonialism in this region, and particularly in this Islamic region of northern Africa, continued until about 1962, which was the end of the Algerian occupation. We had, of course, a war that took place over this. Finally, Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, realized that this was not a tenable thing to do, to continue, and they decided to finally end that colonial rule. And since that, there became a sort of a domino effect with these colonies in Africa that were indeed Muslim in most cases, and thus led to the liberation of those countries. The last of which was basically Djibouti in 1970. So, interesting ways to look at that. And I jump again. You've heard of Afghanistan, right? Well, so 2001, the French joined the coalition with multiple other nations, indeed, to participate in those efforts. I think overall they sent about 4,000 troops to Afghanistan to assist in the coalition operations. And most recently, the Mali thing, you may have been hearing about that over the last couple of years, really. Since 2013, there was a coup, actually, in Mali in 2012. 2013, the French, the former colony, again, keep in mind that Mali was a former French colony, went in to try to stabilize the region. Of course, let's not forget, this is post-Libya here, so the whole region is very volatile, very unstable with a lack of centralized, officially recognized government, for example, in Algeria, so a lot of instability in this whole area. So they came in there to try to establish some sort of order, if you will, and that was in 2013. That's magnified a little bit. It's changed dimensions in particular in about 2014 when the Hollande government, which is the current president, decided to expand things out and connect up with the actual hold of the Sahel section of northern Africa and central North Africa. So in order to, again, presumably establish some sort of line of defense or line of stability politically and otherwise. Okay, so that's kind of your big background piece there I wanted to throw in there. Another thing to be considering here in terms of understanding the forces that might drive Islamism, if you will, terrorism, jihadism, and so forth in the French context are things like what's called laïcité or secularism. In France. There's a long tradition of secularism in France. It goes back actually prior to 1905, but this is the big official law, 1905, that establishes a separation, an official separation of church and state in the French context. And it's one to which it is a law to which people typically refer, have referred ever since. The interesting thing about this law, of course, it sounds okay, separation of church and state sounds in some objective way like a positive thing, and we have this same sort of idea built into our own understanding of relationship between the religions and our political system in this country. And how has that been working out? It's very fluid, right? But we don't have it has not become a law in this country, right? Whereas in France it was established as a law in 1905. All kinds of reasons behind this, but it did not, at this point, didn't have anything to do with the Muslim world, okay? This was the desire to keep the Catholic Church out of politics, okay? Now since then, since 1905, of course, it's evolved, right? The tradition has become significantly well established, but now, as of, especially since the big immigration developments over the last couple of decades, and we could say even since the end of the post-colonial period there, we have a whole new meaning, a whole new layer of issues in place here, where on the one hand it seems to be suggesting that you're going to have a, how should I put, religious equality, and this is the idea here, to protect les droits de l'homme, the rights of man, equality, right? And what are the three big ideas in French society that they always talk about? Three big principles of French society we should all protect. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. You've heard those things, maybe, okay. What's liberté? Freedom, okay. Égalité, equality, and fraternité, right? Fraternity, which is sort of a social cooperation as part of that principle here. Of course, in the U.S., we have that really interesting zinger, which is what? In America, what is our? Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, some of my students know that, Jesse, we talked about this before, right? The pursuit of happiness. The French go, what? Yeah. What's that about? Of course, they're thinking, well, that's built in. If you're free and you're equal and you're, behaving well with each other, you're going to be happy somehow. But a different perspective on things. But in any case, it's very important here. But what's happened, of course, we know that with these new immigrant populations coming in, they might want to express themselves in ways that do not lend themselves perhaps to the ideals set out in this particular constitutional option here, this law. And so what has happened, if you have that tension, okay? We've seen it over many, actually a few decades now. A lot of it has been around the idea of the wearing of the veil, okay? For women in particular, and it all comes to a head in the educational system, in fact, in France, where again, it's supposed to be that division between any kind of religious affiliations or expression and the state, the political state, okay? It's supposed to be a certain kind of neutrality there. Well, that is at the same time, when you have a sort of institutionalized equality, you also, in a sense, deny a certain kind of equality to the expression of faith, okay? We have that tension to some extent, likewise, in our own society, but it's particularly strong in France. So when we understand sometimes the motives that might drive people, perhaps, of other religious or ideological persuasions to be unhappy, you have to be looking at those kinds of factors. So let's move on a little bit here. Under Sarkozy, Nicolas Sarkozy and Hollande, François Hollande, the current president. So this is the previous president, 2007 and 2012, and Hollande came in 2012 and he's currently president, as you probably know. Well, the fun thing about Sarkozy is before he was president, he was interior minister. So he got all up in things for several years prior to even being president, and maybe that was one of the reasons, sort of an anti-immigrant sentiment across France that got him elected, actually, in 2007. But I wanted to point out a few of these things. So this was Sarkozy stuff before he became president, right? The law of March 15, 2004 established, basically made it illegal to wear religious items in public, okay? Particularly in public places where you had institutions in place, such as schools, educational places such as that. Likewise, in 2005, there was an interesting set of revolts or protests took place across Paris. This is something I spoke about actually at Loyola College back in 2006, right after this, where you had, again, Sarkozy had a pretty heavy foot. So what he did is he went into one of the suburbs of Paris near Saint-Denis, which is one of those very heavily mixed populations. There are heavy Islamic representation, cultural representation in that place. And what he did was call them basically fools, okay? Fools and idiots and hooligans, in French, of course, okay? He called them those things publicly. Well, when people call you that publicly, and especially in a situation such as that, you can imagine the blowback is pretty big. So there started to be all these protests in the streets and so forth, and so that was really what was going on indeed during that period of time. We saw cars being burned. Actually, a couple of protesters got killed because they hid in a transformer site for some power station. Let's get away from the police, and they hopped in there and they got electrocuted, okay? Well, okay, that's killing people as well on top of this protest, which made that population even more unhappy. But that was 2005, again, before he became president. And like I said, public insults, okay, directed at the Muslim community officially from the Ministry of the Interior, okay? Then we have, I'm jumping a little bit here, engagement in Afghanistan and Mali, so this is 2001, okay? Obviously a little bit earlier initially, but then Mali, of course, we're talking 2013, okay? And then finally we have, I'm jumping likewise again, Manuel Valls is the Prime Minister of France these days. He's the principal spokesman of the government there outside of the President. And he has enacted a number of different laws and so forth that have likewise been directed at immigration quotas, security, all kinds of ways to monitor and otherwise limit the freedoms of certain populations perceived to be threats in some way or another to the state, and you can imagine who's implied there. And it's obvious to everyone who is. Okay? Now finally, the proposed constitutional changes, that's in play as of the 13th November attack. Okay? It was just the very second day, on the 14th of November, that François Hollande, the president, came out and declared that there should be these constitutional changes in place. And they are still in the process of evaluating this. It's going through all the motions and so forth involved in this. But there's interesting changes there. They go kind of to the same thing. Monitoring security, okay? Almost like legalized random search and seizure, okay? Limitations on movement. You could shut down any kind of religious building or religious site that might be implicated in some sort of terrorist activity. And I would mention to you, by the way, that in France, religious buildings are under the control, the supervision of either local municipalities or the nation. They are not privately owned, okay? They are not church-owned in any way, shape, or form, okay? So that's something they're doing. Lots of these changes are involved there. I know I'm running out of time. I just want to run through a little bit more. Realities of Muslim life in France. The big idea is ghettoization, unemployment, discrimination there. French population today, for those of you, anybody know about how many French citizens we have? Close, 66 million, 66.5 roughly, okay? We have the Muslim populations in France and Europe. Does anybody have any idea what the Muslim population in France is, roughly?
5 million, 6 million?
It's actually closer to 6 million of it. You're going to get different statistics depending on whose data set you're looking at. And the problem here is that you're not allowed to collect data on religious affiliation in France. Okay? So, it's a gray zone. Again, it's part of that equality, liberty, freedom thing. Okay? We're not supposed to be picking you out in terms of your religious affiliation. Across France, so we have, what, 6 million roughly here. If you look at other countries in Europe, okay, you're going to see significantly lower numbers, somewhat lower numbers, I should say, to very low numbers. In terms of the percentage of the population, though, if you're 6 million, right, you're 6 million Muslims in France, and you got a population of 66 million, what's your percentage of population of Muslims in France? Ish, give me about 9%, okay? About 9%. That's a fairly high percentage of the population, okay? There are places, indeed, that are higher in percentage. I would mention this, not in Europe, but Russia, for example, has 27, at least the statistics say 27 million Muslims, okay, officially registered in some way or another. In Russia, significantly higher percentage there. Okay, unemployment, okay, when you've got people that are systematically denied the possibility of work, you tend to generate unhappiness, right? So that's been the case again for populations, the Muslim population, and remember they are the immigrant population. They tend to be disenfranchised in this respect. So unemployment rates, the overall official unemployment rate in France right now is about 10%. What is it here?
6, something like that?
Yeah, it depends where you're looking, right?
Yeah, 5.
They say it's under 5%, okay, and that depends who in the government you're talking to, right? But anyway, it's under 5-ish, under 5%, right? But in France, it's double that, okay? In Europe, it's even significantly higher in many other countries there. But it's still pretty high. That's pretty bad. What do you suppose the unemployment rate for Muslims would be? And I'm going to put it slightly differently. I've got 2 minutes left. The unemployment rate for regions of the country where we find a large population of Muslims. Any guesses?
30%?
Maybe 40.
Okay, I hear good numbers out there. Not 90%, it's about 50%. Okay, so again, not a lot of opportunities there. Housing, again, limited opportunities there. They tend to be, especially in the Paris region, which is where we find most of the Islamic population that we're talking about, the immigrant population. Again, the HLM, the habitation loyer modéré in that region, tend to be run-down project type of buildings for the most part, and discrimination overall. Okay, I'm going to finish with this. So give me just 1 minute on this. There's a lot to do in here, but I'm just going to skim by it real quick. This Olivier Roy that I mentioned to you earlier wrote this really cool article that came out in Foreign Policy, as I said back in January here, at least in English. Okay, France's Oedipal Islamist complex. Okay, the bottom line of this is, I thought was so cool, so different, because you think it might have to do with true ideological difference or religious protest and so forth. The position that Roy mentions here is quite a different view of it. He makes the point essentially that the kinds of people that were participating in the terror attacks that we saw in November, okay, were a very specific group. Okay? He finds statistically, and this has been shown to be pretty valid here, that they were not first-generation people, immigrants that came over. They were not, recently arrived Syrian refugees. They were not that kind of a group of people. These were second-generation, okay, second-generation sons and daughters of immigrants, okay, from the Muslim world of different sorts, including Syria and so forth. Okay. And what he ultimately proposes here, I put some of the ideas that he maps out here. What I want to jump to here is this, basically, what he finds here. It's not that they're expressing some sort of religious ideals. Rather, they are using religious ideals for their own purposes. Okay? And again, Edip mentioned those kinds of things to some extent in his earlier commentary. Okay, this idea of fanatical individualism is one that seems to be very prominent in their reaction to the situations that I described to you earlier. Okay, we mentioned, you notice, you've been hearing this, right? A lot of these people that they're finding participating in this tend to be family members. Okay, literally brothers. Okay, brothers or buddies. Remember this Al-Qaida guys? Okay, in Boston, brothers, right? And that tends to be what they are finding a great deal. In these particular kinds of cells that are conducting these sorts of operations in France, and likewise in Belgium. Okay, so these are these radicalized small groups of buddies, as he puts it here. And finally, I think this idea is really interesting here, that converts choose Islam. Okay, here. Okay, and this is converts he's speaking about here. He's speaking about French, former Christians, presumably, or non-Muslim French citizens who converted to Islam, but the idea applies more or less to all of them. They choose Islam because it's the only thing on the market of radical rebellion. Joining the Islamic State offers the certainty of terrorizing. So it becomes an opportunity here, okay? That seems to be the case. They're using, again, the Islamic religion, Islam. They're using the Muslim religion in order to allow themselves to express their own personal angst, their own personal anxieties, their own generational splits, okay? All those things very often that young people, especially, in the 20s to 30s, might be feeling when they don't have a job, they don't have an education, they don't see an opportunity for themselves, and they're finding this as a way to express that. So take a look at it. It's really a cool article.